saw you paint a picture of a face, a face that wasn't even close to mine. I know I shouldn't be in love, but it's so hard to move on. You haven't changed, you stayed the same. But if you did, I'd still love you anyway.
We're probably talking about 60, maybe 70. So the upper part of the hollow, I think was about 32 folks. But it's one of those numbers that would obviously change each year because there was a lot more movement in and out than I think the mythology about this place, would allow for. The mythology tells us, people moved up here and built one house and stayed there for 100 years and nothing ever changed. But people were working outside the hollows, going as far as DC, working in West Virginia, moving into the Piedmont, moving into the valley, coming back, buying and selling houses, buying and selling farms, renting from family members. So trying to pinpoint exactly who lived where at what time was actually a lot harder than I thought it would be. I'm just always so happy that it's still here. If it's early 20th century, then people are heading out and going to work. There was actually this end of the hollow. At that time, there was a lot of poultry being kept. So I think George Corbin had 3 hen houses. So it's gathering those eggs, taking them down to Nethers, trading them for, either selling them or trading them for supplies. But George Corbin would also, he kept his car 2 miles away, further down the hollow. He'd get in that car and maybe go to work on the railroad in West Virginia, or maybe he was driving some of his homemade spirits to, as far as Washington, D.C., according to his own words, his own oral history. But if he was taking that stuff up to Skyland, he would go on foot or take a mule, because it sold better, right? To be seen as this mountaineer, wearing old clothes, carrying all this stuff, maybe a few rattlesnake hides to go with it, and it is exactly what people wanted to see and to buy at Skyland. But then the next day he might get in his car and go somewhere else.
I would, even though you wouldn't do the same. I'd give you the world like I promised I would, even though you wouldn't do the same.
I had a strong interest in the southern upland region, Appalachian culture, buildings, material culture, those sorts of things. So I came down into Nicholson Hollow in 1990 because a friend had shared some research on buildings that he'd seen here, and I wanted to come and see the buildings. And I read all the stuff that was available about the park people and all the things from Hollow folk about backward isolation and all those tropes. And the second I came down into the hollow and I looked at some of these sites and I looked at the ground around these home sites, and I saw things like Coke bottles and car parts and all the sorts of things that shouldn't have been here if any of those stories were true. So I was immediately hooked on the potential of the archaeology, the historical archaeology, meaning the archaeology of periods, with documentation, and in this case, 20th century archaeology, that it could actually change understandings and it could contribute something. And the more I learned about, how people were treated when they were displaced and the way these sort of falsehoods about their lives were used, it sort of really fired me up to to do the proper research, to record these things and to get a much better understanding of what life actually was like up here, as opposed to what, journalists and University of Chicago sociologists were telling us it was like in the 1930s. So this end of Nicholson Hollow was settled actually fairly late, so 1880s, 1890s. So this building wasn't built until 1909, and it was built by George Corbin. And he built it, actually, the lands that we're sitting on was actually lands of his father, Madison Corbin. So if we sat out in the front porch here and looked through the trees, once upon a time we would see Madison Corbin's house. So Madison Corbin acquired that land in, I think, 1887, and then he gives, he had, I think it was 70 some acres, and he deeded 4 acres to George Corbin. So when the park movement started, and when George and his family had to leave here, he's only getting compensation for 4 acres of land, and it doesn't even really cover the cost of building materials for this house. Was a portion of a ray gun, which we found in Corbin Hollow, and it was just so fantastic, not just because it's wonderfully tactile and it actually said where it was made, Wyandotte, Michigan, in 1933, but because finding a toy ray gun in Corbin Hollow in and of itself just contradicted everything in Hollow folk. Because Hollow folk tells us the children had no toys and that they were not of the 20th century. And so, this was the period, the 1930s, of the whole Buck Rogers and the 25th century craze. And so there were lots of toys, space toys out there, and they made their way into the hollows.